From Anthony Perkins returning to play his part in the Psycho franchise, to Harrison Ford reprising his role as Indiana Jones nearly 20 years later, here are some actors who came back for their old roles. Starting with Ellen DeGeneres returning for Finding Dory. For her role as Dory, that blue tangfish with the catchphrase for the ages, "Just keep swimming," it remains one of the greatest animated films of all time, and Ellen DeGeneres gave us the famous voice behind Dory. Given the success of that character, it was hardly a surprise that Dory got her own film in 2016. Finding Dory, and DeGeneres obviously returned. That too, 13 years after the first part. In fact, it was such a hit that the film became the 5th highest grossing animated film of all time, crossing the $1 billion mark. But not every return is that successful, as Kurt Russell witnessed with his return in the 1996 film Escape from L.A. But scratch that for a moment, just how cool was Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken in Escape from New York? He was on hand to deliver one of the most iconic roles as the cool action hero and provided the blueprint, which was copied many times after he did it. Unfortunately for Russell, by the time he reprised his role as Plissken in the 1996 film Escape from L.A., the market had become too saturated and he didn't get the same love that he did in the first part. Although, I have to blame the franchise for now doing it at least a decade earlier, because this could have really gone big. But the makers of the Halloween franchise didn't make the same mistake, as they cashed out big time, and Jamie Lee Curtis also returned despite taking a break in the trilogy. That's right, the Scream Queen. Jamie Lee Curtis has returned many times over the years for her iconic role as Laurie Strode, but it hasn't always been an immediate return. After starring in Halloween 2, Halloween H2O, Strode's character returned to the screen after nearly 17 years, and 20 years after her debut in the original Halloween. She would go on to take another break before returning in David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy in 2018, only 16 years after her last appearance. It remains one of the most amazing roles in the horror genre. But how about another fantastic horror thriller film? Psycho with Anthony Perkins returning to play his role as Norman Bates 23 years later. The Bates Motel. Alfred Hitchcock gave us one of the greatest films of all time, Psycho, and it wouldn't have been possible without Perkins. After so much success in 1960, it would take nearly 23 years for the 2 sequels that followed, with Perkins returning for both of them in 1983 and 1986, and delivering iconic performances again. Don't get me wrong, iconic roles aren't limited to horror films, only though, as the next entry is from the sci-fi and adventure action genre. Any guesses? That's right, Leonard Nimoy is the legendary Spock. Few characters have been as big and successful as Nimoy's Spock from Star Trek, and after starring in the original film in the 90s, it was a big achievement from the directors to get him to return in 2009. He played Spock Prime 18 years later, and it was a huge success, with people over the moon getting to see Nimoy in action as Spock. And if Star Trek's going to make an entry, then it's only fair to bring back one of the most iconic characters from Star Wars too, right? Okay, this was an easy one, with Mark Hamill coming back as Luke Skywalker, the fiercest Jedi of them all. Despite staying away from the franchise for decades, Hamill was always mostly known for his fantastic role as Luke Skywalker. And that's why Twitter exploded when he returned to the final moments of Episode 7, The Force Awakens, much to the excitement of the fans. Even though it wasn't exactly what the fans were looking for, Hamill's return wielding a lightsaber was simply stunning to witness. Talking about stunning comebacks, I'll be taking you to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield reprised their roles as Spider-Man in the record-breaking Spider-Man No Way Home. It was one of the worst-kept secrets, and there were many other actors who returned for that film. This is what made it such a special film, as they had all those villains return too. But despite the fact that everyone knew what was going to happen, it was still marvelous. The first premieres worldwide had viral videos of people going crazy the moment both Tobey and Andrew appear on the screens. And both of them delivered the perfect performance too. Marvel found the perfect balance between humor and emotion, and that blend allowed it to be one of the greatest returns of all time. I mean, Maguire's first film as Spider-Man came out back in 2002, so a return 20 years later was bound to be big. But that's not the only film you remember from your childhood, right? Because I can't be friends with someone who didn't grow up admitting Ralph Macchio's iconic Daniel LaRusso from The Karate Kid. Ah, what a film! What an immensely popular franchise! That crane kick is basically the reason the cast of Karate Kid found a new place to reprise their roles in Cobra Kai. It follows the story of LaRusso's ongoing feud with William Zabka's Johnny Lawrence, and it was sensational to witness the return of both of them in Cobra Kai. Despite the two average sequels, I'm glad they went ahead with the TV series. Up next, I'll be taking you to the Alien universe, where Sigourney Weaver returned for more, and the world remains in debt for her for doing so. Two outworldly performances, literally, from Weaver as Ellen Ripley, the most fabulous final girl of all time, was simply not enough for the world. That's why even Weaver struggled to turn her back to those roles and returned to take on the horrific creatures that nearly killed her in the first place. Well, I have to say that Alien 3 and Alien Resurrection weren't great. It was still great to see Ripley return, even though it failed to reignite interest in the franchise, something that the next entry certainly didn't struggle with, as I'm talking about the one and only Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford, the whip-wielding archaeologist who nearly turned me into one too, before I realized that most archaeologists, at least in the real world, don't actually have any use for whips. He became a huge part of pop culture back in the 80s with that brilliant performance, and then he returned for more, nearly 2 decades later in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of Crystal Skull. Despite underwhelming audiences and critics, the quest for more Indy is something that'll never die, and it seems that the journey for the Crystal Skull wasn't his final adventure, as he's returning for more. That too, alongside Mads Mikkelsen and Phoebe Waller-Bridge in Indiana Jones 5. It won't be directed by Steven Spielberg, but I have high hopes for James Mangold to end the series on a high. And for my final entry, the video just won't be complete without Keanu Reeves' Neo, which shocked the world with a return in The Matrix Resurrections. Again, it was hardly as good as the original one, and the fact that it came out 18 years later had something to do with it. Nonetheless, it was great to see Keanu return as Neo and carry the film, even though it eventually fell flat. That's all I had on actors who reprised their old roles.